The creepiest camping trips you'll ever hear about. Let me tell you about the time I was 15 on a Boy Scout campout. This is still burned into my memory, and honestly, it's the reason I'll never go camping again. It all started when my friend, who was supposed to share a tent with me, bailed last minute. That left me to pitch the tent by myself, which, let me tell you, wasn't easy. The sun had already dipped below the horizon, and we'd spent the entire day hiking. So by the time we got back to camp, it was pitch dark. Imagine fumbling around with poles and ropes, trying to figure it out alone, while your body just screams for rest. Eventually, a fellow scout took pity on me and helped get the tent up, and we finally ate dinner around the fire. After that, we did the typical scary campfire stories, ones that seemed silly at the time. Looking back, though, those stories were nothing compared to what was about to happen. With my tent all set up and no one to share it with, I actually kind of liked having it to myself. More space, right? I fell asleep pretty fast, but I woke up in the middle of the night to this weird sound. Stomping. Not like an animal, but heavy footsteps circling around my tent. My first thought was that it was another scout, maybe someone heading into the woods to pee or trying to freak me out. Here's the kicker. Our scoutmasters had us set up our tents far apart. We weren't right next to each other like most campsites. The nearest tent was pretty far from mine, so whoever was walking around out there wasn't just passing by. They were deliberately stomping around my tent in circles. I remember my heart thudding in my chest, but I forced myself to call out, "Who's there?" Silence. Then, after what felt like forever, the stomping stopped, and whoever it was walked off into the woods. I felt this urge to go out and follow, but it didn't seem worth it. After a few minutes, I managed to lie back down, trying to convince myself it was just one of the guys messing around. But then, it started again. The stomping, circling my tent over and over. This time, I was pissed. I unzipped the tent, ready to tell off whoever was messing with me. But when I looked out, I wasn't met with a scout. I came face to face with a man. A grown man. He was huge, easily 6'5", and looked to be in his mid-30s. And that smile, it was the creepiest thing I've ever seen. His lips curled up into this slow, deliberate grin, and then he brought his finger to his lips, like he was shushing me. My blood went cold. I couldn't even scream. I just turned and bolted, running faster than I ever had in my life toward the scoutmaster's tent. I was screaming like a little kid, but honestly, I didn't care. When I reached the scoutmaster's tent, he was already rushing out, rifle in hand, as I blurted out what I'd seen. They rushed over to my tent, but the man was gone. All they found were his footprints, circling my tent, over and over. That was it. The next morning, we packed up, and the trip ended early. I've never been camping since, and honestly, I don't think I ever will. The Night Laugher in the Willamette Forest. Last summer, a couple of my buddies and I decided to go camping by the Willamette River. It was supposed to be a fun, laid-back trip. We had a long hike to get to a secluded spot deep in the woods, perfect for fishing, drinking, and just hanging out under the stars. After a night of fishing and drinking way too much, we finally decided to call it a night. Probably sometime after 2 a.m. I was sharing a tent with one friend while the other two guys were in another tent. At first, everything seemed normal. We could hear them laughing in the distance about something stupid. Typical camping night, right? But after a while, their laughing started to get annoying. So we yelled over to them, "Hey, shut up." Only one of them shouted back, "It's not us." That's when it hit me. The laughing wasn't coming from their tent. It wasn't coming from anyone we knew. It was the sound of a single person laughing like a maniac out there in the woods. Even through my drunken haze, something about it was off. The laugh didn't sound right. It was loud, hollow, like it was missing something. Worse, it was getting louder, closer. Now, think about this for a second. We were deep in the woods, far from any other campers. No one should have been out there. My friend sat up, his eyes wide with fear. We could hear the other guys freaking out too. And as the laugh got closer, it became clear. It wasn't a friendly laugh. It was like something you'd hear from a crazy drunk guy, but also not quite human. The laugh stopped right at the edge of our camp, but we couldn't hear any footsteps. Nothing. You can't walk through thick woods without making noise, right? And yet, there it was, just this laugh, hanging in the air. Suddenly, the laughing stopped. Complete silence. That's when we heard it, something pressing against the side of our tent, rubbing against the fabric. In the moonlight, we saw the outline of a hand, pushing in. We screamed. Screamed. We bolted out of the tent and ran like hell. I don't even remember how, but we found the car and peeled out of there. I've never been so scared in my life. I don't know who or what that was, but there was no way it was someone just messing around. That laugh still haunts me. The mystery photos. After I graduated college, I decided to go backpacking alone in the Canadian wilderness. I thought it would be a peaceful, rejuvenating experience. You know, just me and nature. And for the most part, it was. I didn't see anyone the entire time, except for one guy in a canoe off in the distance. I was out there for 7 days, completely disconnected. No cell phone reception, nothing. Just me, my gear, and a couple of disposable cameras I'd brought to capture some memories. When I got back home and had the photos developed, I expected to see nothing but nature shots. Sunrises, lakes, maybe a few pictures of my camp. But halfway through the first roll, I froze. My hands were shaking. There were 2 pictures of me, asleep in my tent. Someone had been standing over me, watching me, and took those photos while I was completely out cold. I still don't know who took those pictures. I never heard anyone near my camp, and I didn't see a soul. To this day, I keep my curtains shut tight and my door locked. I still get that uneasy feeling like someone's out there, watching. The homeless stalker. My boyfriend and I decided to go camping out at the gorge one weekend. We'd camped there before, but this time it was just the 2 of us. No group of friends, no distractions, just some quality time in nature. We parked the car, grabbed our gear, and started the mile-long hike to our usual spot. On the way, we passed 2 guys who gave off a seriously creepy vibe. They came out of the trailhead, stared us down for way too long, and then slunk back to their beat-up old Volkswagen camper van. I brushed it off, probably just my imagination. When we finally got to our spot, we saw a camp up on the hill. But I chose a place further down, out of sight. As we were setting up, this guy appeared out of nowhere, offering to sell us firewood. He looked dirty, like he'd been living in the woods for weeks. I laughed it off, telling him we could just gather our own wood. But then he said something that gave me chills. He told me I wouldn't find any, because he and his friends had already cleared it all out. I thought he said he was camping alone. When I asked him about it, he stammered and changed his story, talking about some guys camping on the other side of the river. It didn't add up. His stories kept getting weirder, and I felt that heavy pit of dread growing in my stomach. After dark, we heard branches snapping around our camp. Someone was out there, watching us. I knew it was him. My boyfriend was trying to keep calm, but I could see the fear in his eyes too. We decided to pack up as quietly as possible and get out. But as soon as we stood up to leave, we heard him shout, "Leaving so soon?" It was like he knew what we were planning all along. We didn't stick around to find out what would happen next. We ran, leaving some of our gear behind, and didn't stop until we were back at the car. That was the last time I went camping. There's something about being watched in the middle of nowhere that shakes you to your core. The Watcher in the Woods. Last year, my friends and I decided to go camping in a remote forest, about 2 hours from the nearest town. We'd heard it was a great spot for stargazing, with no light pollution and endless skies. The plan was to spend the weekend out there, away from everything, with no distractions, just nature and us. The first night was perfect. We set up our tents near a small clearing, surrounded by tall pines that made the air smell like fresh Christmas trees. After dinner, we sat around the campfire, laughing and telling stories, until the only sound was the crackling of the fire and the occasional owl hooting in the distance. Eventually, we all turned in for the night. I woke up sometime in the early hours of the morning, around 2 or 3 a.m., to the sound of footsteps outside the tent. They were slow and deliberate, like someone was trying not to be heard but wasn't doing a good job at it. My heart started racing. I lay completely still, listening, hoping it was just one of my friends getting up to use the bathroom. But the footsteps didn't go away. They circled the tent, round and round. I whispered, "Is that you?" thinking it had to be one of my friends, but no one answered. The footsteps stopped for a moment, right next to the tent. I could feel whoever it was standing there, just waiting. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. Suddenly, I heard a faint whisper, right outside the tent. I couldn't make out what it said, but it sounded wrong, like someone was trying to speak without moving their mouth. I held my breath, praying they'd go away. Then, the footsteps started again, slowly moving away. I lay there, terrified, for what felt like hours before I finally drifted off into a restless sleep. In the morning, I thought I'd dreamt the whole thing, until I saw the footprints in the dirt around my tent. I wasn't imagining it. Someone or something had been there. I asked my friends if any of them had gotten up during the night, but they all shook their heads. We tried to laugh it off, saying it must have been an animal, but deep down we all knew that was no animal. The rest of the trip was filled with a tension we couldn't shake. It felt like we were being watched the entire time, that though we never saw anyone or anything again. When we finally packed up and left, I had one last look at the campsite, and there, just beyond the tree line, I saw something move. I couldn't make out what it was, but I knew we were being watched. The girl in the tent. This happened a few summers ago when my boyfriend and I decided to camp at a small lake tucked away in the mountains. It was the perfect spot. Crystal clear water, a sandy little beach, and completely isolated. We were excited to have a quiet, romantic weekend away from everything. The first day was amazing. We swam in the lake, cooked over an open fire, and watched the stars come out one by one, lighting up the sky like I'd never seen before. It was peaceful, quiet, until it wasn't. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up to the sound of soft crying. At first I thought I was dreaming, but the sound was too clear, too real. It was a girl's voice, muffled but close, like it was coming from right outside the tent. I shook my boyfriend awake, whispering, "Do you hear that?" He groggily listened for a moment and nodded. We both sat there listening to the crying, which seemed to be getting louder. Maybe someone's lost? He suggested, though he didn't sound convinced. I mean, no one else was out there. At least no one we'd seen. We unzipped the tent just a little, peering out into the dark, but there was no one. The crying stopped. For a long minute, we just sat there, staring into the woods, our eyes straining to see any sign of movement. But nothing happened. Eventually, we crawled back into the tent, telling ourselves it was probably an animal, though I couldn't think of any animal that cried like that. A few hours later, just as we were drifting back to sleep, the crying started again. This time, it was even louder, as if whoever, or whatever, was now standing right outside the tent. It was a horrible sound, like the girl was in pain or terrified of something. My heart was racing and I couldn't bring myself to open the tent again. Then we heard it, something dragging against the tent's fabric. It started near our feet and moved up slowly, as if someone was running their fingers across it. I clutched my boyfriend's arm, my whole body trembling. He grabbed the flashlight, zipped open the tent, and shone it out into the dark. Nothing. The crying had stopped again. The next morning, we packed up as fast as we could and got out of there. I've read stories of ghosts haunting certain places, but I never thought I'd experience something like that. To this day, I can still hear that crying when I close my eyes. The camper who never left. A couple of years ago, my buddy Jeff and I decided to take a camping trip up in the mountains. It was supposed to be an easy, relaxing weekend. Just us, a couple of beers, and the great outdoors. The place we camped was deep in the woods, miles away from the nearest road. We parked the truck, hiked about 2 hours to a secluded clearing, and set up camp. The first day went by without a hitch. We hiked, fished, and even built a great fire to cook over. The woods were calm, and we didn't see another soul out there. That night, though, something changed. It must have been around midnight when I woke up to the sound of footsteps outside our tent. At first, I figured it was Jeff, but then I realized he was still asleep next to me. The footsteps sounded deliberate, like someone was walking in circles around the tent. Whoever it was wasn't in any rush. They were slow, purposeful. I whispered to Jeff, "Hey, do you hear that?" He grumbled awake and listened for a moment before saying, "It's probably just an animal." He rolled back over, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The next day, we explored deeper into the woods and found an old, abandoned campsite. The tent was torn and sagging, like it hadn't been used in years. But what really creeped us out was that there were still personal belongings scattered around. Clothes, a couple of shoes, even a rusted-out pocket knife. It was like whoever had been camping here had just disappeared. As we looked around, Jeff picked up a battered notebook. Flipping through the pages, we found weird, unsettling scribbles. Pages and pages of writing, all saying the same thing. "He's watching me." That night, the footsteps came again. This time they were closer, slower, as if whoever it was wanted us to know they were there. I stayed awake, listening, every muscle in my body tensed with fear. But the thing that terrified me the most, the footsteps never went away. They circled the tent for hours, long after Jeff fell asleep, until the first light of dawn broke. In the morning, we didn't stick around to find out who or what was out there. We hiked back to the truck, faster than I think we've ever walked in our lives, and didn't say a word about what we'd heard until we were safely back in town. A week later, I couldn't get the whole thing out of my head, so I did some research. Turns out, years ago, a man had gone missing in those woods while camping alone. They never found his body, just his empty tent and scattered belongings. It still makes me wonder, was that his tent we found? And if so, who or what was walking around our camp? The shadow by the river. Last summer, my girlfriend and I decided to spend a weekend camping by a quiet river that cut through a remote part of the forest. We wanted to escape from everything. No phones, no people, just the sound of water flowing and the wind in the trees. We found a spot right by the riverbank, pitched our tent, and spent the day lounging by the water. The evening was peaceful, the kind that makes you feel like nothing in the world could go wrong. As the sun started to set, we built a fire, cooked dinner, and listened to the quiet hum of the forest around us. It was perfect. But when night fully descended, things took a strange turn. We were sitting by the fire when my girlfriend noticed something moving on the other side of the river. At first, I thought it was just the shadows playing tricks on her, but then I saw it too, a dark figure standing on the opposite bank. It was hard to make out in the dim light, but it seemed to be just standing there, motionless, watching us. I called out, "Hello," but got no answer. The figure didn't move. I tried to convince myself it was just a tree or a rock casting a weird shadow, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The firelight flickered, and for a moment it looked like the figure had shifted positions, like it was leaning forward. My girlfriend was visibly shaken. "Let's go inside the tent," she whispered. We zipped ourselves inside, trying to act like we weren't completely freaked out, but the silence outside was deafening. Every little noise, every rustle of leaves, felt like it was amplified. Hours passed. I don't think either of us really slept. Around 2 a.m., I heard the sound of slow, deliberate footsteps by the river. The figure had crossed to our side. I held my breath, listening as the footsteps circled around the tent, pausing now and then, as if whoever or whatever was out there was deciding what to do next. My girlfriend grabbed my arm. "Do you hear that?" she whispered. I nodded, too scared to make a sound. Suddenly, the footsteps stopped right next to the tent. We heard a long, slow breath, like someone was standing inches away from us, listening. I don't know how long we lay there, frozen, but eventually the steps started again, fading into the distance. In the morning, we packed up and left without a word. We didn't see any footprints by the riverbank or around our campsite, but I know what we heard, and I know that whatever was out there didn't belong in that forest. The Whispering Woods. About 3 years ago, my friends and I went camping in a national park that was notorious for being untouched by people. No cell service, no electricity, just endless trees and mountains. It was exactly what we wanted: isolation. We hiked for hours before finding a small clearing to set up camp. By the time we finished pitching our tents, the sun was starting to set. That night, as we were sitting around the fire, roasting marshmallows and sharing ghost stories, something strange happened. The air grew unnaturally still. No breeze, no rustling of leaves, nothing. Then, out of nowhere, we started hearing voices. At first, we thought it was the wind or maybe an animal, but the voices were unmistakable. Faint, distant whispers like people were talking just out of earshot. My buddy Alex, always the skeptic, laughed it off. "It's just the wind," he said, but we all knew it wasn't. The whispers were too clear, too human. They seemed to be coming from the trees, growing louder and more distinct, as if whoever was speaking was getting closer. We turned off our lanterns and sat in the dark, trying to listen. The whispers continued, but now we could make out words, our names. They were whispering our names. "Who's there?" I shouted into the trees. No response, just more whispering, now frantic, like it was right on top of us. Alex stood up, his face pale, and said, "We need to get out of here." But we couldn't leave in the middle of the night. We were miles from the nearest road, and the whispers were everywhere, surrounding us. We had no choice but to wait it out. That night, we barely slept. The whispers never stopped. They'd fade, then come back stronger, always calling our names, always circling the camp. Every time we thought it was over, they'd return. At one point, I swear I saw shadows moving between the trees, watching us. When dawn finally broke, the whispers vanished. We packed up and hiked out as fast as we could, none of us daring to speak. On the drive home, we tried to make sense of what happened, but none of us could explain it. The whispers still haunt me, though. Sometimes when I'm alone in a quiet room, I think I hear them again, faint, just at the edge of hearing, calling my name. The vanishing campfire. 2 summers ago, I went on a solo camping trip to clear my head. I'd been dealing with a lot of stress at work, and the idea of being alone in the wilderness, away from everything, sounded perfect. I found a secluded spot deep in the mountains and set up camp near a small stream. It was peaceful, exactly what I needed. The first night went smoothly. I spent the evening reading by the campfire, listening to the calming sounds of the forest. Around 10 p.m., I decided to turn in. I doused the fire, crawled into my tent, and drifted off to sleep. I woke up a few hours later, disoriented, to the sound of crackling wood. It took me a moment to realize that the fire, the one I'd put out, was burning again. I unzipped the tent and peered out. The flames were dancing, but something was off. There was no one around, no woodpile nearby. I'd used up all the firewood earlier that night. Then I saw it. A figure, barely visible in the flickering light, was sitting by the fire. It was a person, or at least it looked like one, hunched over, staring into the flames. I froze. My mind raced. Was this someone who had stumbled into my camp? Why were they just sitting there? I watched for what felt like hours, trying to figure out what to do. But the figure never moved, never acknowledged me. I called out, "Hey!" But there was no response. It just kept staring into the fire. Suddenly, the fire flickered, and the figure seemed to vanish. One moment it was there, and the next it was gone. The fire was still burning, but the figure had disappeared like smoke. I grabbed my flashlight and bolted out of the tent, shining it around the camp. No one, no footprints, nothing. The fire still burned, but I had no idea how it had been relit. Terrified, I spent the rest of the night sitting in the tent, too afraid to sleep. I kept the flashlight on, scanning the area every few minutes, but nothing else happened. The next morning, the fire was out, and there were no signs of anyone or anything having been there. I packed up and hiked out as fast as I could, not daring to look back. Even now, I can't explain what I saw that night. I've tried to tell myself it was my imagination, that I was just tired and seeing things, but deep down, I know that something or someone was out there with me.